Thanks very much indeed, and welcome back here to the Media Centre in Quebec City. Of course, one of the major themes, despite all the rhetoric around trade and tariffs and possible wars in that regard between the United States and their European allies, one of the major points of discussion here over the next 2 days will be, among the themes, gender equality and women's empowerment. For the very first time in the history of G7 summits, led by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada, they've established a Gender Equality Advisory Council, and part of that council, a member of that council, is none other than the UN's Executive Director of UN Women and South Africa's former Deputy President, Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, who joins me here. Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, welcome to Canada. I know you've just flown in from Brussels and you stopped by the UN just ahead of South Africa's election as a non-permanent member of the Security Council. What's your immediate reaction to that?
Well, for the South Africa's success, congratulations. We're looking forward to South Africa making a difference in the Security Council.
Certainly not your focus here in Canada. What was your reaction to the leadership on this issue that you've seen from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau? You've got a long-established working relationship with him. What does this Gender Equality Advisory Council mean in real terms?
Well, we have the 7 biggest and richest economies in the world. If we cannot crack gender equality in these 7 countries, you can imagine how difficult it is in other countries. So we want to impress upon these heads of states the importance of investing much better on women, as well as ensuring that while they do that, they are also assisting in the other countries in the world, because they have such a large impact because of their investment, multinational companies on ODA, and specifically about ODA, and the support for developing countries. We would like that at least 20% of the money that they use to support in the developing countries has a direct impact on women and girls. But also the enforcement of the good legislation that addresses gender equality in the G7 countries has to be a way in which it also has an impact on the developing countries. If you take equal pay, for instance, it's not fully implemented in the G7 countries. Getting it right here has direct relevance for these countries when they employ people in the developing countries. We also wanting to impress upon them better investment in education. We've seen girls' education improving in many parts of the world, including the G7 countries, but the quality is still not what it should be, and there's still too many girls that are out of school. So we want them to also have a bias towards girls' education in developing countries. Investment on reproductive rights and the needs of women, both in their own countries and in the developing countries, very critical. If women cannot have control over their own bodies, do not have adequate access to family planning products, that is a major deterrent for women's participation in the labour market.
This, of course, Madam Executive Director, is just one of the themes that will be discussed here. We're hearing all this talk about trade wars and tariffs, and talking about jobs for the economy, for a digital future. How concerned are you that the cause that you represent here is going to be undermined by all the noise we're hearing elsewhere?
Well, we factor that in. Every G7 summit is like this. The issue that is more topical just before the start of the summit dominates, but you have to push your issue in the midst of all the noise. We will have our 2-hour session with the heads of states, and we need to make sure that we make those 2 hours count.
You made a comment to me off camera a short time ago that the women's agenda is broke. You need a lot of money for this agenda. Are you confident you'll be able to get it from some of the leaders here?
Well, we are hoping that we will be able not just to focus on what we can get from the leaders, but also from private sector, from the development banks of all of these 7 countries. They've got significant development banks. So we're not just focusing on these 7 governments, we're also focusing on the different stakeholders and road players in these 7 countries.
Just as you might have a champion in the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, sometimes you also have detractors, and one example of that might be the President of the United States. How concerned are you by the leadership of Donald Trump, particularly on the issue of gender equality and women's empowerment?
Well, we're hoping that the 6 other presidents that we agree with a lot on these issues of gender equality will be able to take the issue and be significant, louder voices in order to make sure that we're not detracted and we're not unfocused. We also need to speak on behalf of and to support the women in the US, for instance, on the issue of paid maternity, which in the US is not yet at a federal level a given, is something that concerns us. We want to support that. Pockets of poverty within the US, especially in the black communities, in the communities where there's loss of migrants, is an issue of concern. So we will keep talking anyway, whoever is in power in the US.
Let's talk about the value of legislation and perhaps the lack of legislation we are seeing in various countries on this issue. This is one of the talking points here over the next couple of days. How do you convince leaders that legislation is the key in terms of the progress you seek in the area that you cover?
In the G7 countries, the problem is not the absence of legislation, it's the poor implementation of legislation and the fact that there are no sanctions when countries do not implement their own legislation fully. So here the emphasis is on better implementation, enforcement mechanism, monitoring mechanism, and some form of sanction when legislation is not being implemented. And of course, we'll also raise the issue of violence against women, especially violence against women at the workplace, which, as you know, is a big and a topical issue here in the G7 countries, in the US specifically. We want these countries to support the ILO, who will be presenting this June a new standard on fighting sexual harassment at the workplace. In these debates at the ILO, where you've got employers, trade unions, and governments, you really need to have some champions that will make sure that that resolution will sail through. So we want them to make sure that they play a significant role in accompanying the passing of this resolution and the standard on ending sexual harassment at the workplace.
You know, a conversation, Madam Executive Director, on new legislation in this regard has to be accompanied by the ineffective implementation of existing legislation that we have in countries around the world, particularly in developing countries like South Africa. I mean, you mentioned the fact, gender-based violence. It's about implementing the laws that sometimes are on the books already. How concerned are you that, that as much as you are pushing here for the implementation of new laws, that the ones on the books already are not being implemented to their full might that one would expect?
Extremely concerned about that. This is also something that really needs a strong women's movement in each country to be the watchdog, to be the pushers, because in every country where legislation has been implemented successfully, it has been because there's a strong women's movement that is focused on holding their governments accountable. We also are pushing for involvement of men, who also need to play a role in making sure that both legislation and programs in these different countries are given the attention that they deserve.
You've dealt with this issue in a number of our discussions and in the work that you do. Can you explain why the gender pay gap is something so difficult to overcome? Because,
robbery. It's the greatest robbery. I think that the customers, if you just think about the private sector, customers, shareholders, board members, and of course governments, all of them need to pay attention to this issue, because it actually takes away something that women have earned, something that is their right, something that they deserve, and in the fullness of the life of a working woman, what she loses because of unequal pay, in some cases, is more than 50% of what she should have earned in her whole life, because you add also some of the perks that the women don't have. In some countries, women don't get shares, they don't get promoted. There's just what the ILO calls the motherhood penalty, a number of different ways in which women are actually deprived of the economic benefits they should be getting because of selling their labor.
Childcare is part of that motherhood penalty, is it not?
Absolutely critical. One of the issues that we'll be raising with the G7 leaders, if in the G7 we cannot have universal access to affordable childcare, we would be missing an opportunity to create one of the much needed best practice. The majority of women who struggle to balance their reproductive and productive needs are by and large, unable to do that because of childcare related challenges. And this is something that is very basic, because all of us in every country, we have this thing called a baby. It happens. By now, we should know how to manage in such a way that both men and women are able to co-parent in a manner that does not penalize one of the parents.
Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, thank you so much for your time and good luck over the next couple of days.
Thank you.
The Executive Director of UN Women here as part of a Gender Equality Advisory Council, the first of its kind ever at the G7 Summit, at the behest of our host here, the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And of course, this is a cross-cutting issue among all the themes that are being discussed here. Gender equality and women's empowerment important in terms of the oceans economy that President Ramaphosa will be engaged in, whether you're talking about jobs for the future, whether you're talking about economic growth that is inclusive. Placing women and women's empowerment at the center is probably the best route to success. And I imagine Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka would agree with that as I hand you back to the studio in Johannesburg.
Thank you very much, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, UN correspondent as well as US correspondent for SABC News. Over to Francis now, continuing with international news.